Hello, welcome again to FAIRtax Power Radio. I'm Bob Paxton.
And I'm Bob Scarborough.
And we are the FAIRtax Guys. We still can't get synced up on our Zoom thing anymore. We got spoiled there sitting there in the studio last week.
Yeah, no kidding. But the thing is that people should join in wherever they may be listening or watching, because we're all FAIRtax guys and gals, but we're all on the same team, and that I think that's the big thing. And we've got a single focus now, and that is to consider the alternative to what is happening in the Internal Revenue Service, and how we can kind of change things for the much better with a tax on consumption, getting rid of the Internal Revenue Service altogether. Take it from this to nothing, just like that.
I'm going to get it right this week that Jade flew in from Colorado to join us last week, and so it's cool. We now have an official invitation to go out there to Denver and do a show from out there. So we'll have to pull that off sometime. But real quick programming note: we were looking at the schedule that Wally's FAIRtax World, that runs once a quarter here on FAIRtax Power Radio, last ran in early August, which would make it due again in early November, early next month, about a month from now. But he has said he's run into a kind of a pile of work there at his day job, and wants to postpone the next Wally's World to mid-December. So that's kind of when we'll. I am not going to Denver in December. We're going to have to do that one with a Zoom like we always do.
Next year,
maybe next summer we can go out there and see if Denver has anything equivalent to Mr. Barbecue.
Well, we were talking about what that might be too.
Well,
maybe some elk or who knows? I mean, Buffalo. They're Buffalo in, or is that Montana? No.
It's time. We did not get to do a Congress.gov last week because we had Jade there at the radio station. But I got to tell you, the Congress critters have been busy. We've got quite a number of things to get into today. So let's just kind of dig right in if I can. And I think our first one today, I am really toying with putting this one in the Hall of Shame. See if you can figure out what this says. Okay.
Go right ahead.
HR 9130. Now, I'm going to read it exactly the way it's written: to amend the Internal Revenue Code of 1986 to extend the exemption from the income tax on alternative motorboat fuels sold as supplies for vessels or aircraft to include certain vessels serving only one coast. Got that?
Are we discriminating against bodies of water now?
I don't know, but this is just kind of from looking at it, parsing this as best I can. Apparently, there is an excise tax on alternative motorboat fuels, which you could also put in aircraft, but there is an exemption to that excise tax for some vessels. Apparently, vessels serving only one coast do not qualify for that exemption. And this bill, HR 9130, wants to extend that exemption so that aircraft and vessels serving only one coast do qualify for the exemption and don't have to pay excise tax if they put alternative motorboat fuel in their vessels. That's the best I can come up with on that one.
Well, you just keep working on that. It sounded pretty good on the first draft.
Well, just for under the what in the world is that doing in the tax code? I think I'm going to slide that one into the Hall of Shame.
That needs to be in the Hall of Shame for sure. There's 2 or 3 good ones in there already. That one might be close to the top.
All right. Oh, let me mention this before we move on. We are now over what we do here, the Internal Revenue Code, in quotes in the search bar at the top of the Congress.gov page. There are now over 2,000 hits on that search when you're looking at only legislation in the current Congress. 2020 hits on the search if you put the Internal Revenue Code in quotes and hit the go button on there. And mercy, if you arrange them introduction, newest to oldest, that one we just talked about was on the top one, and this one's right under it. HR 9121 to amend the Internal Revenue Code to establish a tax credit for abatement and sequestration of carbon dioxide equivalent. I know what carbon dioxide is. I'm not sure what carbon dioxide equivalent is, But if you could establish a tax credit for abatement and sequestration of carbon dioxide equivalent through agricultural methods, decipher that one there, Kimosabe.
Well, I would have to go back to the 7th or 8th grade science class that I had, but I just don't have that paperwork with me right now, and so I'll have to consider that and get back to you.
Oh, okay. Well, in that case, I'll move on to the next one. This is HR 9080 to amend the Internal Revenue Code to establish new community benefit standards for tax-exempt hospital organizations, and your favorite phrase, for other purposes.
Absolutely.
I'm not why we're putting community benefit standards in the tax code, who knows, but HR 9080 wants to change that. Okay, moving on, HR 9076. This is a cool one. To amend the Internal Revenue Code of 1986 to allow parents who are pursuing a higher education degree to take the tax credit for expenses for household and dependent care services
while they're going to college.
And apparently, if you're pursuing a higher education degree and you have to incur expenses for household or dependent care services in order to be able to pursue your degree, they're going to let the expenses for those household and dependent care services, be tax exempt or take a tax credit for that. That's HR 9076.
Let me just put this one little thought in everybody's mind while we're talking about education and taxes and tax credits. The fair tax is not applied to tuition. The fair tax is not applied to tuition. If you go to college, you write the check, there's no tax involved when it's a tax on consumption, specifically the fair tax. Yes, and I think that's significant.
Tuition is not considered a retail purchase, and the fair tax is levied only against retail purchases of new goods and services. If you go to the thrift store and buy used, no fair tax on that either. If you buy a used car, no fair tax that one. If you buy a pre-existing house, no fair tax there. So the fair tax gives you a lot of flexibility in by which purchases you make and when you make them as to when you pay your taxes and how much.
That's right.
That's pretty cool. One more here before we get back into the meat and potatoes of the show today. This is for HR 9060 to amend the Internal Revenue Code to allow for a credit against tax for sales at retail of safe firearm storage devices. That looks vaguely familiar, but that was just introduced a couple of days ago on September 29th by Representative Levin in California. But so they're messing with the tax code. They want to give you a credit for this and a credit for that, and then they want to take your credit away for this, and they have an extension on it. The whole thing is just so daggone complicated. There's only one way to fix it. That is rip it all out by the roots and replace it with a fair tax.
Absolutely. I would think that there are probably numerous lines of code that cancel each other out, but you'll never know which lines cancel the other or another. But I wonder if there's some part of the construction of the tax code that would indeed negate another part if the two ever came together.
I don't know. You've seen all of it. You ought to have an excise tax, then you have an exemption to the excise tax, then you want to repeal the exemptions in some cases, and you want to extend the exemption in other cases. The Congress critters are just always messing with this thing, and it just needs to go away. That's why we do this segment, so we can show people just how insanely insane the tax code is and what the Congress critters are constantly doing to it at the behest of lobbyists and special interests, no doubt.
Right, exactly. And we're fighting hard to bring the attention, and this is where our viewers and listeners can help us out, to share the video, to share the audio, wherever you might happen to be listening or watching, with 5 or 6 of your friends, and ask them to do the same. And we'd be excited to have a few more people like the FAIRtax Guys page and the FAIRtax page on Facebook to follow us and keep up with what's going on.
All right. Well, I'll tell you what. Let's move on to a little bit. We are always, going over articles that we find in various different sources, but this one that actually came from our own Jim Bennett, who writes the weekly Grassroots Corner. It comes out every Monday. As a matter of fact, this episode is going to stream on Tuesday, the 11th. The Grassroots Corner we're referring to published yesterday on October the 10th. Remember a couple of weeks ago, we talked about a lady that had inherited a couple of $1 million in a foreign bank account.
Yes.
And she ran afoul of the tax requirements, and she tried to make things right. And the IRS rewarded her honesty by trying to take about half of what she had. And this is a similar story. Again, we talked to John Richardson a few weeks ago, the attorney there who represents Americans living abroad who are subject to a tax provision that only one other country in the world imposes on its citizens, and that is citizen-based taxation. If you live outside the United States and you make money outside the United States, Uncle Sam still wants his share of it.
Yeah. There you go. And it's a battle. It's probably the most confusing part of your decision to live outside of the borders and even work outside of the borders of the United States, is dealing with the Internal Revenue Service and how you calculate your obligation there with what you.
I'll tell you what we need to do. We need to kind of file this away for future reference. You know, our buddy John Gaver, who got all of those FAIRtax pledge signers out there in Texas this last time around, he has moved to Panama.
Yeah.
So after he's been there a while, give him a year or so, and we'll see if we can get him on Zoom and let him talk firsthand about what he has to put up with living outside the United States. And I assume he's maintaining his citizenship. If he's watching the show, he can drop it in the comments, but I'm pretty sure he would retain his U.S. citizenship. But
sure,
we'll have to get him on and get his story. Let's move on to this Grassroots Corner story. This is just, it's crazy. Makes your blood boil. There's a gentleman, Alexandru, I'm guessing that's how you pronounce that, Alexandru, Alexandru Bittner. Now, Jim says he's not a fair tax advocate yet, but he's really somebody you should know. He was born in Romania, came to the United States as a child, grew up in the United States, became, here's the key, a naturalized American citizen. But when communism fell in the 1980s, he went back to Romania, and he did pretty well for himself.
Right.
So, oops, wait a minute. I got a little button there. There we go. little die. I don't know if
he was there for over 2 decades. Went back, but in the meantime, he was here, and he became a citizen of the United States.
Mm-hmm.
And this is where it really starts to get complicated.
Here's where it starts to get fun. The ignorance of the U.S. tax law really came back to bite him. He was unaware of 2 obligations that U.S. citizens living abroad uniquely share with only one other country of the world, that being Eritrea. He did not realize that he had to file U.S. federal income tax returns, even though he didn't live here or maintain a residence here. And this is what got him in trouble. He was unaware of the obligation to report his bank accounts to the U.S. Treasury. Even though some of these accounts were with Romanian banks, handled his personal transactions, but he also did a lot of business dealings as well.
Right.
Okay? And he was responsible. He was working with, 272 bank accounts over the years. That's 54.4 per year. Jim did the math for us out there. But after he did all this, he moved back to the United States and settled in Texas. But later he became aware of the obligations that he was supposed to have met while living in Romania. And of course, he didn't know about it at the time. But once he came back here, he says, all right, I want to do the right thing. So he engaged an accountant, came forward, filed all the returns and reports for the time in Romania, although it was just a bit late, because he didn't realize he had to do it.
The delinquencies amounted to about 5 years worth of reports for those bank accounts, averaging 54.4 bank accounts every year. Some of the accounts personal, some accounts belong to corporations or other entities that Bittner controlled.
Okay.
Now, go ahead and let's wake up from the civil penalties.
Let me ask you this. What is the civil penalty for failing to report a foreign bank account in a timely manner?
Up to $10,000.
Notice that up to 10 grand, not necessarily 10 grand, but it says the IRS can penalize you up to $10,000 for failing to report a foreign bank account on time. So you would think, that Mr. Bittner would get a break. He came forward on his own. He was trying to do the right thing. He filed the reports. He was late, but he still tried to file the reports, tried to satisfy the spirit of the law, if not exactly the letter of the law. And what happened to him?
Penalty.
That's your cue. What happened to him?
He had to pay a lot of money. It was a full pound of flesh, wrapped, sealed, out the door. How much? $2.72 million assessment.
The penalty is up to $10,000. The IRS levied the full $10,000 for each of the 272 accounts that he was supposed to report and didn't report on time. So $10,000 a piece times 272 accounts, you hit it. $2.72 million the IRS tried to assess him for, even though the IRS had agreed that it was not, a willful effort to evade the law. He just didn't know.
Well, you always know when you're standing there with the police officer and his pad's out, he says, ignorance of the law is no excuse.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Get your traffic violation just because you turned left and on a red light. It doesn't work that way. It's a right turn you can do, but amazing, 2.72. I mean, it's definitely a money-making enterprise, the Internal Revenue Service, and I guess they look for everything that they can find. It's amazing to me, though, that they're not doubling into an equal amount of effort to find people or find a way to cover the errors that are made in an ongoing basis. Some of the things that they are taking advantage of and being inconsistent in some of the things that they are doing.
Jade mentioned
they have the ability to write their own rules over there.
Listen, Jade mentioned this last week, that IRS agents, like any other employees in any other endeavor, you'll get job performance evaluations. And if you're an IRS auditor and you go out and you come back and say, Scarborough's fine, I couldn't find anything wrong with his taxes, they're going to say, you ain't doing your job. You've got to challenge something. So that's how that goes. So look, continuing the story, what the IRS did, they went to the U.S. District Court for the Eastern District of Texas and filed suit against Mr. Bittner. I'm not sure why they would have to use the court's power to collect that money when they're already one of the most powerful agencies in the government. But the IRS asked but they did. The IRS asked the Eastern District Court for a summary judgment, meaning they wanted the court to decide the suit without even holding a trial because there was no dispute about the facts. But Alexandru cross-moved. He asked the court to declare that under the applicable statutes, his liability is capped at $50,000 because he figured that out on a per report. Missed 5 years, $10,000 a year, $50,000. He said, all right, wait a minute. I was late, but let's go this by per report, which is, of course, one per year, instead of the 272 total accounts. And what did the district court do?
Well, they agreed with Alexandru, and they determined that the IRS's penalty assessment was unlawful. So precedent has been set. Bittner's liability was capped at $50,000, a $10,000 maximum penalty for each annual report, not for the bank accounts.
Now, did the IRS accept that ruling? No. They appealed to the U.S. Circuit Court for the Fifth Circuit in New Orleans. And what did the Fifth Circuit do? They reversed the district court's decision and reinstated the original $2.72 million assessment to the IRS. This is a high stakes game that we're playing here.
Excuse me while I lift my head off the table. Unbelievable. I mean, but this goes on all the time. There are stories like this that are out there, and in smaller dollar denominations, smaller amounts. But think about it for a minute, and the stress that an individual would have to endure at the hands of this federal agency.
Oh, okay. Well, we have not heard the end of the story yet, because Mr. Bittner has petitioned to the U.S. Supreme Court to take up the case. And one of the things he mentioned was that, he was in Texas, and the Texas court ruled one way, then the circuit court, or the appeals court in New Orleans, reversed that. But he pointed to a California case which was deciding basically the same issue. And in the California case, that was settled on a per report basis, which would make $50,000, rather than a per account basis that the Texas court did, which added up to $2.72 billion. And he says, wait a minute, the result here should not depend on whether I live in Texas or whether I live in California, because Texas went one way, California went the other way. And he is asking the Supreme Court to step in and figure this all out. And they have granted his petition.
It'll be it'll be in a few weeks, actually, in November.
And they're going to hear the case in early November. Of course, you're not going to get the decision until several months after that. So we'll have to check that in. But the thing is, this, again, is just such a crazy system. None of this happens. None of this happens under the fair tax. You could live in Romania, you could live in Panama, you could live anywhere in the world, still be a U.S. citizen, and not be subject to Uncle Sam's taxation if we had the fair tax, because you're not making retail purchases in the United States.
That's right. You could live on the top of Mount Suribachi, and still you would, with the fair tax, you can go anywhere you want to. And I'm wondering if there are other people out there that have similar stories. I'd love to collect some up, and don't necessarily post them on social media, but reach out to us on the website or through the email, and let us know. Not trying to get into anybody's business, but I would think that these stories are out there, and plenty of them.
Yeah, well, you remember, we talked to the attorney, John Richardson, a few weeks ago here on FAIRtax Power Radio. He's the one that brought this case to Jim Bennett's attention.
Right.
So
that's right.
So now, just here in the past couple of weeks here on FAIRtax Power Radio, we've had two separate stories of American citizens living outside the United States, and they are just being hammered by the tax code. That if we had the fair tax, it wouldn't happen to them. So that's right. It's what they're doing. What the IRS is doing to these folks is just plain not fair. We need to get rid of them.
Well, we're way past time, and again, I'll keep bringing this up because I think it's significant in understanding where we are in our minds about an income tax. It's all we've ever known. You'd have to be how many years, Bob? 100 and something, 110, 15.
Oh, how long the income tax has had? Since 1913. So that's 13 to 23 would be what,
109 years.
109 years we've had an income tax.
So we think this might be the only way for the federal government to collect money into the Treasury, and it's not. I hear. We have friends, libertarians, and some folks, other folks who say, well, you shouldn't be an income tax, and it shouldn't be taxing anyway. It's not what we believe in. But the thing is that the federal government has to be funded at some level in order to provide the basic services. Now we start talking about a constitutional issue of how much should the federal government be allowed to do in the operating and what they're involved in. We have to create a parallel, equal amount plan to collect the same amount of money that's being collected now in order to effectively change. And then the debate starts after the fair tax is enacted on whether we should pay down debt or whether we should be doing all the things. Is the Department of Education something that's worthwhile? Should more money go to the military or less? And those are the debates that happen after the fair tax gets passed. And all we're asking for is everybody out there listening to consider a tax on consumption, specifically the fair tax, because there is nothing else out there like it. And don't get confused about flat tax, because that's still an income tax. and we're still beholden to an agency, the Internal Revenue Service, that has the ability to dig into our finances, which is horrendous. So what a horrendous thing to have to. And people especially like Alexandru Bittner, for crying out loud.
Yeah, that's just criminal what the IRS has tried to do to him and to the other lady we were talking about a couple of weeks ago. Yeah. And so it needs to go. So again, let's thank Jim Bennett for letting us borrow rather heavily from his article for this FAIRtax Power Radio show.
Pick that up online at fairtax.org too, if you'd like to read the details and dig into that a little more. What a horror story for Alexandru Bittner. Gracious.
Yeah, this was just published. The Grassroots Corner was published yesterday. It's available at fairtax.org. Go check it out. But I'll tell you what, this stories like that, if there's nothing else that the IRS ever does, stories like that means that the IRS deserves to be exterminated from the face of the earth, and the fair tax is the only way to do it. Because, as you mentioned, flat tax won't do it, because flat tax is actually flat income tax. People never insert that word income when they're talking about a flat tax, but that's exactly what it is.
We need to encourage everybody too. We're getting into the final weeks before the midterm elections, and the conversations, while you have your people that are running for office, either the incumbents or the challengers in the U.S. House of Representatives and Senate and all, now is the time to engage them in a conversation. At least put the word out there. The fair tax is where we need to be. And I believe people, and we talked about this with Jay the other day, that state, and we talked about it with our friend Elizabeth at the fair here in Winston-Salem. We need state level encouragement as well. States can get involved in this too, so you might want to consider striking up a conversation with your local representative there in your district for consideration at your state level.
Let's mention something here that we haven't done in quite a while here on FAIRtax Power Radio. If you would like to get a hold of us, send us a question or a comment, thefairtaxguys@gmail.com. We haven't given the email address out in quite a while, but it's thefairtaxguys@gmail.com. Now, if you want to go to our website, there's no "the" on the front of it. It's just fairtaxguys.com. You can watch the current episode of FAIRtax Power Radio there, or you can link that to our YouTube channel that has the archive of everything. And I'm afraid that's about going to wrap up this edition of FAIRtax Power Radio. Man, time flies when you're having fun and you're telling good stories.
Yeah, that was a good one today. Put this one on the bookmark and watch it over and over again. Really get upset about people living overseas, how they have to deal with it, even in more cases than we have to.
Let's see what we can come up with for next week here on FAIRtax Power Radio. But until then, we're going to have to wrap this up. I'm Bob Paxton.
I'm Bob Scarborough.
And we are the FAIRtax Guys, reminding you that the fair tax is the only truly fair tax. And once you understand it,
you'll demand it.
The FAIRtax is a tax replacement plan where we take all the federal income taxes, including corporate, personal, gift, and estate taxes, and replace them with one national consumption tax on new purchases above the poverty level only. This form of consumption tax comes with no exceptions and is progressive, not regressive. The poor are not paying more, and the rich are not paying less. What makes it progressive is that all Americans are untaxed up to the poverty level via the prebate, much like your standard tax deduction. The taxes are collected by retail businesses at state level, so the system is more accountable. The IRS is done away with, and you have control over your money and what the overall tax rate your household pays. The fair tax is revenue neutral, so the government receives the same amount of money as they do now, and it's fair because you decide what's fair, not them. To learn more, visit fairtax.org and be sure to like us on social media to help educate your friends and spread the word.